that's the sort of centrifugal force which has always been a worry. If, for example, Russia were to lose badly and you had a sort of Carthaginian peace, then you could have a scenario, and it is only scenarios, of course, not certainties, where Russia tears itself apart and goes into many separate parts. Potentially, that could be a dangerous situation. It's Bosnia with nukes, which you don't really want.
Yeah, well, Vladimir Putin and his regime put an awful lot of effort into stopping the impact of the war or his special military operation on the Muscovites and the people of St. Petersburg. But it seems now with the fuel shortages that that's coming home, and with the Ukrainian drone attacks that are going into Moscow, that people are beginning to realize it. Do you think that Putin is right to be concerned about the people? But and do you think that given some of the history, that there is actually a possibility that the people might find some catalyst to bring them together and rise up against him, or certainly become more vocal in their opposition? How do you think Putin's likely to react as soon as he starts to see that happening?
Well, I think we've always sort of thought of the Russian Federation as really centered around parts of European Russia, and that there are bits of the Federation of Russia which could tear themselves apart from the sort of Russia-St. Petersburg sort of axis if the burden upon them in terms of casualties and in terms of their inability to get the basics of life, including stuff to fuel their homes, their cars. That's the sort of centrifugal force which has always been a worry. If, for example, Russia were to lose badly and you had a sort of Carthaginian peace, then you could have a scenario, and it is only scenarios, of course, not certainties, where Russia tears itself apart and goes into many separate parts. Potentially, that could be a dangerous situation. It's Bosnia with nukes, which you don't really want. So Putin would probably be very wary of that, and maybe that is a decision point for him when he would know that he has to negotiate when that likely scenario were a highly likely one in the intelligence framework within Russia. But it's a very centralized regime. All the elites around him are sort of mea culpa, I think. And so, again, it's very, very difficult to see what will finally knock this over. But you can be assured that, the more that you knock over that sort of either the production, the refining, or the transportation of the gas and oil, then that means that the sinews of war are more difficult for Russia to maintain in the future.
But the more you knock over, the more you think you're having an effect on Russia, the more they seem to then almost bulge out and carry out another activity somewhere else. We've seen reports in the last few days of a potential anti-Ukraine alliance forming within the EU. We've got Hungary with Orban trying to team up with Fico of Slovakia and Bibas from the Czech Republic. And you manipulate then the decision-making processes within the EU to try and make it more difficult for support for Ukraine. Does this have Putin's footprints in that rebel butter pat that's in the fridge? Is this something that we should be concerned about? And do you think the EU has got the wherewithal to identify it and to deal with those sorts of threats?
Well, it could do. And again, that, as I said, slightly plays into Putin's theory of victory, that at some stage the West, and this is Central Europe, the Central Europe part of the West, will tire of the war and will not give Ukraine support anymore. I don't think it's really, again, one of the things, as you know, that we look at is framing bias. That would be another framing bias in the sense that they don't want to support Ukraine in an active military sense. They want to support them in a peace-focused sense. The key then question comes on from that. What sort of peace are you on about? Are you on about a surrender peace, which essentially is what Putin's root causes would lead you to, a demilitarized, neutral, denazified, which essentially means Ukraine back in the Russian sphere of influence? Or do you mean a just peace? So until they can articulate that, you don't know what they mean from their peace-focused rather than war-focused. But it's absolutely clear that they are blockers and disruptors, which can inhibit the decision-making of the EU and the speed of EU decision-making. And that's not a good thing when you've had great unanimity, particularly within the NATO sphere of decisions, because, of course, it's the action, counteraction, which has led, for example, to Sweden and Finland joining NATO. So, most of the actions of Putin have led to a response which he didn't perceive from the West. This is one that he might have perceived if he can use enough FSB money and leverage over some of those who are more Slavic than Western Europe to achieve his ends. It's the great thing about the politics of force rather than force of politics rather than the politics of force.
But again, politics of force and putting threats out there. Putin's launched and done a big thing about this nuclear-powered cruise missile that everyone was jumping up and down about because it could supposedly stay in the air for as long as it wanted to and hit any target around the world. Do you think it's actually a credible military threat, or is it another part of his wider information operation?
Well, I think, again, I don't think there's any doubt that the timing of the announcement of this is to do with, the fact that he's not getting a meeting in Hungary in the next couple of weeks. It's that sort of or else kind of part. The last time we had this sort of rhetoric was in September 22 before the mobilization. I don't think it's a credible thing. I'm sure the Americans were all over it in terms of MASINT, measurement intelligence. Would know everything about it. And one of the things that we've seen from the Russians, whether it is a credible capability, I think the NATO designation for it is Skyfall, is another matter, because one of the things which has not been credible from a Russian side, I think, is the way that they've posited a lot of their weapons as hypersonic weapons, when most of the time they've not been hypersonic in a true sense of the capabilities which the Americans are designating. So again, it's one of those fear factors, it's the or else. We've had this a number of times, don't do something or do something or else. We've had that in We'll Starve You with the grain, the continuing one, which we had in the winter of 22-23, ongoing now by the Russians about We'll Freeze You, essentially what they're trying to do again with Ukraine. But we had the invincibility centers in 22-23 over the winter, and I think that will come into play again. And Ukraine, of course, can get external sources of electricity, but that is again a campaign from the Russians that will continue, I think, for the winter. And the nuclear one is always that one which they'll play. I do think that if Russia are not successful, can't put a time frame on it, at least another year, then there does come into play the potential for them saying, if we can't achieve our objectives by using conventional military force, then they might up the ante in terms of the nuclear threats. I think that, again, is a road to nowhere. I don't think China would let them go there. But if they really did think that they were, that Putin was being blamed, the forces are being defeated, Russian forces, then it's still something that we need to look at for the future. And of course, no one's being complacent about Russia nuclear weapons.
Well, just for those that are listening in, MASINT, the measurement and signature intelligence, if you've got a nuclear-powered cruise missile, it's got a little nuclear reactor in it, and that's going to be like a big red beacon to the sensors that are in space watching for these things. So you'll be able to track it everywhere, and it'll leave a trail of nuclear material because it won't have lots of shielding around it because that would be too heavy, and therefore it's a big arrow pointing to exactly where it is. And of course, you could only use it with a nuclear warhead, otherwise you've turned it into a dirty bomb. Because if you'd conventional warhead, you're then spreading nasty nuclear or radiological material around a wide area, which in itself will bring political ramifications. So, there's a lot of talk about it. The one person who's been silent over all of this in the last week or so is Donald Trump. What do you think his next moves are? What do you think's going? If anyone can predict what's going on in his mind, what do you think is going on in his mind at the moment?
Well, I don't think he has been silent. I think he's consistent. I mean, the one in the last week which stuck with me was go home, stop killing people, and be done. As I've said a number of times, I do think he believes in a humanitarian peace. I think it is significant that for the first time in Trump 2.0, we have had overt sanctions against Russia. If that doesn't bring Russia to the table, which I don't believe it will, then you would hopefully expect to see the secondary sanctions come in through the Senate. The Senate, particularly Blumenthal and Lindsey Graham, have said that they're waiting for the president to give the tick. Of course, that's slightly more difficult at the moment because we haven't got any formed government doing any work in America at the moment. But that's what I would like to see as the next move. I think there was this strategic hesitancy about Tomahawk missiles, but I think if you did put the secondary sanctions, be it somewhere between 100 and 500% has been mentioned, and that is the sledgehammer sanctions, which really would make a strategic difference, I think, if it absolutely cut off the access of that oil to most of the countries around the world, the diminution of the pot of wealth of the Russians, that may cause those Clausewitzian things we were talking about really to have more resonance than they might at the moment.
Well, Chip, on that note, let's hope that Donald Trump is watching us and taking your advice, because he now knows how to stop the war and to get his Nobel Peace Prize. But Chip, it's been really great talking to you again on Frontline.
Thank you for having me, Philip.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.